And Senior Fellow at the Centre for American Progress, Brian Katulis, is with us from Washington, D.C. and joining us in studio, Israela Oron, still with us, along with I24 News Senior Middle East Correspondent, Mohammed Al-Kassim. Mohammed, we'll get you to kick us off. Of course, Israel is treating the northern front as Syria and Lebanon together, insofar as how one directly affects the other. What is Israel worried about in terms of these two borders presenting as a united front against Israel?
Well, they're more united now than they ever been. I mean, let's not forget that Hezbollah's fighters have been assisting the Syrian government and its military in its internal civil conflict for the last few years, and thousands of Hezbollah's fighters have been on the ground taking leading role in fighting the Syrian opposition. And that's why Israel is not only worried about its borders and the front with Lebanon, but also now with Syria, as the Syrian military has even taken over control of the area close to the Golan Heights. That's why it's important and critical for Israel right now. Hezbollah's fighters have gained great experience in the last few years fighting on the ground, and also they have put their hands on a great deal of weapon caches. So now they're much more advanced, much more prepared to get into another war with Israel. What
do we know, Israela, about where Hezbollah is in fact storing these rockets? There are accusations that Hezbollah is in fact using civilians living in Lebanon as human shields.
The best way for them to hide the rockets and to protect them is to put them into a civilian population where it will be difficult for Israel to attack it, and of course also in tunnels, underground tunnels, and places that it will be difficult to attack. However, and this is what they did also 12 years ago, and it caused a lot of problems to the Israeli military to attack those places, because we really try to avoid hitting civilians during this war. I hope that since there was this kind of deterrence after the second Lebanon war between both sides, it's like a mutual deterrence, and so both sides, we, the Israelis, and also the Hezbollah, we know that a war is really against our mutual interest. It's against the interest of Israel, and it's against the interest of Hezbollah. The only question is Hezbollah loyal to the people of Lebanon, or are they loyal to the direction coming from Tehran? If they will only obey the orders of Tehran and they will try to escalate the situation in the northern border, I think the people of Syria will, the people of Lebanon, the civilians in Lebanon, will pay the price for it.
All right, Brian Katulis, I want to come to you in Washington, D.C. To that point, then, how is the landscape in Syria and Lebanon providing an avenue for the next direct confrontation between Israel and Iran? Of course, the first ever was in February when we saw that Iranian drone flying into Israeli airspace.
Look, I'm deeply concerned for Israel and all of my friends there. I was most recently there in May when there was a conflagration between Israel when it saw a threat across the border in Syria and acted. So the landscape has been changing over the past several years, but I'm worried about what happened in 2018, particularly in southern Syria, with the collapse of a truce between the U.S., Russia, Jordan. And in essence, one of your previous speakers said that Russia is a much more dominant actor. And I think that's a serious concern. My second concern is that the United States, I don't think, is as vigilant about this. The Trump administration for much of this year has not had a coherent approach to Syria. I would say it's been one of passive appeasement of Iran and of Russia in Syria, and that is a threat to Israel. So I think we need to stand with our friends in Israel and do more to actually help them address these threats. And I'm glad to see the actions that were taken today.
Okay, well, in fact, last Friday, Hezbollah issued a warning of its own in a video to Israel with the message, "Attack and you'll regret it." Let's have a look at a bit of that. Now, Mohammed, we're hearing a lot more from defence analysts about the growing confidence of Hezbollah. I suppose, what other evidence do we have of that?
We have a number of them. I think this highly produced video shows that this is part of the war between Hezbollah and Israel, just similar to what we've seen between Hamas and Israel. This is part of the psychological war. Hezbollah has been able to obtain a number of high, very sophisticated weapons from Iran, and also the training that they got, their fighters, from fighting alongside the Iranian fighters in Syria and the Syrian military in Syria. In the last couple of weeks, we've heard just last week of allegedly an Iranian plane landing in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, with highly sophisticated weapons on it. And Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah's party, has been very open about saying that they have in their possession more than 100,000 missiles that could reach even deeper into Israel than we've seen in the last war between Hezbollah and Israel. And because of this kind of confidence, that we don't know for a fact if that's the case, but this is part of the psychological war that both sides are using to intimidate each other. But there is no doubt that Hezbollah in the last few years, even though they've lost some of their fighters in Syria, they've gained tremendous expertise from 2000 at least. They gained tremendous expertise from fighting on the ground there, but also gained a lot of weapons, which could really tip the balance even slightly in the next war.
Brian, did you want to add to that? Sorry.
Yes, psychological war is very important, especially now, and the capabilities of Hezbollah regarding his psychological war is definitely improved. However, Israel does not show the same videos that we have, for very good reasons, of targets in Lebanon. And the fact that Nasrallah doesn't hesitate to say that he is going to conquer the Galilee and the northern part of Israel means that Israel is really prepared for everything. And the fact that they are trying to influence the public opinion through those kind of videos, it's nice, but it's not really the balance of power between Israel and the Hezbollah.
Now, Brian, Israel worries that Hezbollah will try to cross the border and occupy an Israeli village. It's calling the tunnels that it's now revealed attack tunnels. What do we know about Hezbollah's strategy, and as well as Iran's strategy via Hezbollah?
Well, I think Hezbollah is a key proxy of Iran, and Iran is feeling the effects of this maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration has implemented in tearing up the nuclear deal. And I think the more it feels those stresses and strains on that front, the more you may see some actions like this. My concern, though, is that when you look at the regional security strategy of the United States, I don't actually see a clear approach. And unfortunately, on my most recent trips to Israel, I hear this sense of abandonment on these core security threats in places like Syria from the United States. And I think the United States should be there, will be there. But I think the Trump administration itself has been quite distracted and incoherent in terms of what it is we're going to do in Syria in the long run. Because our position in Syria will have an impact on how far Iran's reach moves westward, and it's only deepened its influence, and that is a threat to Israel, and that's a threat to the United States as well.
Briefly, to close us out, Mohammed, do you share that perspective?
No, I disagree. I think the U.S. is still committed to Israel's security and also is committed to the situation in Syria, even though at the beginning, yes, it wasn't a clear strategy for the U.S. and President Trump's vision of how to go about things in Syria. Right now, we're seeing the U.S. forces work closely with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Those are the Kurdish forces. And the U.S. will not hesitate to target Syrian forces and the Iranian and other forces inside Syria. And also, Israel has the green light to go after Iranian forces inside Syria.
Israel, I want to get just a final thought from you, because Israel has said that it will be addressing what it sees as Iran's funding of this tunnel network. What are its options insofar as that?
First of all, with regard to money and funding, Iran is funding Hezbollah, but since the sanctions restarted from the United States, talking about the support of the the United States. This is an indirect support because they are not able to fund the activity of Hezbollah the way that they did before. So it will be really a big mistake to do something against Israel, especially when they have such a cut down in their finance situation.